On a winter morning in 1927, the sound of hammers rang across a barrier island in Palm Beach, Florida. Workers, some Italian stonemasons, some Cuban laborers, many African-American craftsmen from Georgia and the Carolinas, laid Spanish tiles under a relentless sun while their employer, serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, stood watching from beneath a parasol. She was building something that had never existed in America, a 126-room estate that would cost $7 million, nearly $125 million in today's money, designed to rival the palaces of European royalty. The mansion would consume 118,000 square feet, feature 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and require a staff of 60 just to keep it running. But here's what the society pages never mentioned. The workers building this American palace earned roughly $4 a day, while Post's weekly income from her cereal fortune exceeded $50,000. The marble came from Italy, the tiles from Spain, but the hands that installed them belonged to men whose names would never appear in any dedication plaque. Mar-a-Lago, Spanish for sea to lake, would become the most opulent private residence in Florida, a monument to American excess, and eventually the most politically charged mansion in the nation. But who really built it? What did it cost? And why does its story reveal everything about the promises and contradictions of American wealth? Chapter 1. The Palace. No one wanted stand at the wrought iron gates of Mar-a-Lago today, and you're looking at 17 acres of prime Palm Beach real estate worth over $500 million. The mansion rises before you like a Mediterranean fever dream, its 75-foot tower topped with thousands of imported Spanish tiles, its walls gleaming with Dorian stone, its garden sprawling toward both the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Wyeth. This is American grandeur at its most unapologetic. But rewind to 1927, and this same plot of land was an undeveloped strip of jungle and sand. Palm Beach itself was barely 20 years old as a resort destination, transformed from mangrove swamps by Henry Flagler's railroad. The island was just 8 miles long and half a mile wide, a sliver of land that would become synonymous with American wealth. And Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted to own the most spectacular piece of it. Post was 40 years old, recently remarried to financier Edward F. Hutton, and sitting atop one of America's great fortunes. Her father, C.W. Post, had built the Postum Cereal Company in Battle Creek, Michigan, turning breakfast into an empire. When he died by suicide in 1914, Marjorie inherited everything. She was the sole heir to what would become General Foods Corporation. By 1927, her personal wealth exceeded $250 million, equivalent to roughly $4.5 billion today. She wasn't just rich, she was dynasty rich. But wealth alone didn't guarantee acceptance in Palm Beach society, which was dominated by old money families like the Vanderbilts and Stotesburys. Post needed something that would establish her not just as wealthy, but as American aristocracy. She needed a palace. She hired 2 architects, Marion Wyeth, a society favorite who designed for the Vanderbilts, and Joseph Urban, an Austrian émigré who had designed sets for the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera. Urban brought European theatrical grandeur. Wyeth brought Palm Beach credibility. Together, they would create something that had never existed in America, a hybrid of Spanish, Venetian, and Portuguese architectural styles adapted for the Florida climate and American sensibilities. The location Post chose was strategic. The property stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Wyeth, making it the only estate on the island with water on both sides. This wasn't just about views, it was about control. No one could build near her on either waterfront. She would have privacy that even Rockefeller money couldn't buy. Construction began in 1924 with site preparation. The land had to be cleared, drained, and elevated. Post imported fill dirt and had it carefully graded. Then came the real work. She wanted materials that would last centuries. The estate's foundation required 60,000 cubic feet of concrete. The exterior walls would be built with Dorian stone quarried from a single location to ensure color consistency. The roof would feature 36,000 Spanish tiles, each one handmade, numbered, and imported from a single Seville factory. Inside, Post envisioned rooms that would showcase her growing art collection. She was obsessed with collecting, not just accumulating. She studied provenance, hired experts, and paid premium prices for pieces with royal lineage. The living room would feature a marble mantelpiece from a Venetian palace. The library would have hand-carved oak paneling. The dining room would seat 30 beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. But the true marvel was the engineering hidden from view. Mar-a-Lago would require its own power plant, water filtration system, and climate control, technologies that were cutting edge in the 1920s. The kitchen complex alone occupied 3,000 square feet, with separate preparation areas for pastries, meats, and vegetables. There were walk-in refrigerators, multiple ovens, and storage for a household that entertained weekly. The staff quarters, by contrast, were Spartan. Servants lived in small rooms on the 3rd floor, or in separate buildings on the property. Their spaces had minimal decoration, shared bathrooms, and no climate control. This wasn't unusual for the era, it was expected. The beauty was for guests. The servants were meant to be invisible. Post demanded perfection, and perfection took time. Construction continued through 1927, with costs mounting steadily. The initial budget was $2 million. The final cost approached $7 million. Workers labored in the brutal Florida heat, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 95 degrees. There were no OSHA regulations, no workers' compensation, no overtime pay. Men worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, for wages that barely covered boarding house costs. By the time Mar-a-Lago was completed in 1927, it was the most expensive private residence built in Florida history. It had 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, 12 fireplaces, and 3 bomb shelters. Post added those later during World War II. The property included a 9-hole golf course, tennis courts, a citrus grove, and a tunnel running under South Ocean Boulevard, so Post could reach the beach without crossing the street. But here's the paradox that would define Mar-a-Lago's entire existence. The moment it was finished, it was already obsolete. The stock market would crash in 1929. The era of massive private estates was ending, and Post herself would spend less time at Mar-a-Lago than she'd imagined, preferring her other homes in New York, Washington, D.C., and the Adirondacks. Mar-a-Lago was built to last forever, but it was designed for a world that was already disappearing. Chapter 2. The Serial Princess and Her Golden Cage. Marjorie Merriweather Post didn't grow up in palaces. She was born in 1887 in Springfield, Illinois, the only child of C.W. Post and Ella Letitia Merriweather. Her father was a salesman suffering from health problems when he moved the family to Battle Creek, Michigan, in 1891 to seek treatment at Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's famous sanitarium. It was there, observing Kellogg's experiments with grain-based foods, that C.W. Post saw his opportunity. In 1895, Post launched Postum, a coffee substitute made from wheat, bran, molasses, and wheat. He marketed it relentlessly, spending unprecedented amounts on advertising, up to 25% of revenue, and making claims about health benefits that would never pass modern regulations. The product succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. By 1901, Post was earning $1 million annually. He added Grape Nuts cereal in 1897 and Post Toasties in 1904. He became one of America's first advertising millionaires, proof that you could sell almost anything if you told the right story. Marjorie watched this transformation from daughter of a struggling salesman to heiress of an industrial fortune. She was educated at Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C., trained in the social graces expected of wealthy young women: French, piano, proper etiquette. But she also inherited her father's business instinct and his belief that appearance mattered as much as substance. In 1905, at age 18, she married Edward Bennett Close, a lawyer from a respectable family. They had 2 daughters, but the marriage was unhappy. Close struggled with his role as husband to one of America's wealthiest women. When C.W. Post died in 1914, shooting himself after years of declining mental health, 27-year-old Marjorie inherited his entire fortune. She immediately transformed from rich man's daughter to one of the wealthiest women in America. She divorced Close in 1919 and married Edward F. Hutton, the co-founder of E.F. Hutton and Company, in 1920. Hutton was wealthy in his own right, but Marjorie's fortune dwarfed his. She was the primary investor in many of his business ventures. They had 1 daughter together, Nedaniah, who would later become actress Dina Merrill. By the mid-1920s, Marjorie was operating in the highest circles of American society, but always with the slight disadvantage of new money. The Vanderbilts, Astors, and Stotesburys could trace their wealth back generations. Post's fortune was barely a decade old, built on breakfast cereal, hardly the stuff of aristocratic legend. She compensated by outspending everyone. Her New York apartment occupied the entire 5th floor of 1107 Fifth Avenue and required 18 servants. Her Adirondack camp, Topridge, had 68 buildings. Her yacht, the Sea Cloud, was the largest privately owned sailing vessel in the world at 316 feet long. Mar-a-Lago fit into this pattern. If she couldn't inherit prestige, she would build it, room by room, tile by tile, until even the oldest families had to acknowledge her status. But there was a loneliness in this accumulation. Post married 4 times, each marriage ending in divorce or death, each husband somewhat diminished by her wealth. She collected beautiful objects compulsively: Fabergé eggs, French furniture, Russian icons, Sèvres porcelain. She threw elaborate parties where guests ate from gold plates and drank from crystal goblets. But genuine friendship was rare. How do you trust people when you're worth more than most of them will earn in a lifetime? Mar-a-Lago was designed to solve this problem. It would be a private paradise where Post controlled every detail. She would decide who was invited, what was served, how the rooms looked. It would be her kingdom, answerable to no one. The design reflected her specific tastes and obsessions. The gold and white ballroom featured gold leaf on every surface and could accommodate 300 guests. The Venetian living room showcased her collection of Italian Renaissance pieces. The Spanish living room displayed her Spanish colonial furniture and paintings. Each room was a stage set for a different performance of wealth and culture. But Post was also practical in ways that many society women weren't. She understood business. When she inherited Postum, she didn't simply collect dividends. She actively managed the company, serving on the board and approving major decisions. In 1929, she supported the merger that created General Foods, which would become one of the largest food companies in America. She understood that Mar-a-Lago wasn't just a house, it was an investment, a statement, and a tool for social advancement. She personally oversaw every aspect of Mar-a-Lago's construction, visiting the site regularly, approving material samples, and rejecting anything that didn't meet her standards. Joseph Urban later said she was his most demanding client, but also the one who best understood his artistic vision. She wanted drama, but drama that looked authentic. She wanted luxury, but luxury that suggested good taste rather than mere display. The irony is that Post built Mar-a-Lago just as the world that created her fortune was beginning to crumble. The labor strikes, social reforms, and economic instability of the 1920s foreshadowed bigger changes ahead. Post's father had been a fierce opponent of unions, once hiring armed guards to break up a strike at his Battle Creek factory. That old order, where industrialists held absolute power and workers had few rights, was ending. But Mar-a-Lago was designed as if it would last forever, a monument to a certainty that was already an illusion. Chapter 3. Building Paradise. The Hidden Army. The official groundbreaking for Mar-a-Lago took place in 1924, but the real work had begun months earlier. Before a single stone was laid, Post's team spent nearly a year sourcing materials from around the world. This wasn't simply construction. It was a logistics operation that rivaled a military campaign. Joseph Urban's designs called for architectural elements that simply didn't exist in 1920s America. The 36,000 roof tiles came from a single factory in Seville, Spain, where craftsmen used techniques unchanged since the 16th century. Each tile was made by hand, fired in wood-burning kilns, and carefully numbered before being packed in straw and shipped across the Atlantic. The cost, approximately $150,000, equivalent to $2.7 million today, just for the roof. The exterior stone was Dorian limestone, quarried in a single location to ensure consistent color and grain. Post insisted on this uniformity, believing anything less would look patchwork and cheap. The interior marble came from multiple Italian quarries: white Carrara for the bathrooms, pink Portuguese marble for certain floors, and antique pieces salvaged from Venetian palaces for the showpiece rooms. But materials were only part of the challenge. The real question was, who would install them? The workforce that built Mar-a-Lago was as carefully stratified as the society that would inhabit it. At the top were Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban, the architects who earned substantial fees and whose names would be forever associated with the property. Below them were skilled craftsmen, Italian stonemasons who had trained in centuries-old techniques, German carpenters known for precision, and Austrian artisans who specialized in decorative plasterwork. These European craftsmen commanded premium wages, $8 to $12 per day, roughly double what American workers earned. They were housed in respectable boarding houses in West Palm Beach and treated with deference on the construction site. Their skills were rare, and Post needed them. The next tier consisted of American tradesmen, electricians, plumbers, glaziers. They earned $4 to $6 per day and represented the emerging middle class of skilled labor. Many came from established Palm Beach construction firms. They were white, unionized in some cases, and relatively secure in their employment. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the manual laborers, the men who dug foundations, mixed concrete, hauled materials, and performed the back-breaking work that made everything else possible. This workforce was predominantly Black and Hispanic. African American workers came from Georgia, the Carolinas, and northern Florida, drawn by the promise of steady work. Cuban and Bahamian laborers crossed the water, hoping to earn enough to send money back to their families. These men earned $2.50 to $4 per day, barely enough to cover room and board in the segregated substandard housing on the west side of Palm Beach. They worked in brutal conditions, 10-hour days, 6 days a week, in heat that regularly exceeded 90 degrees. There were no safety harnesses when working at height, no protective gear when handling caustic materials, no workers' compensation if they were injured. One construction supervisor's ledger from 1926 survives in the Palm Beach County Historical Society archives. It records daily attendance and wages for 147 workers over a 3-month period. Of these, 89 are listed only as colored labor, or with first names only: Henry, Joseph, Samuel, their surnames apparently not worth recording. They cleared land, mixed concrete, and hauled materials, and then disappeared from history without even their full names preserved. The Spanish tiles presented a particular challenge: Each numbered tile had to be installed in precise sequence to maintain the pattern Urban had designed. Post hired a Spanish master craftsman, Miguel Castellanos, specifically for this task. Castellanos arrived with 3 assistants and spent 18 months on the roof, working only in morning hours when the heat was bearable. He earned $25 per day, more than most workers made in a week, and lived in a cottage on the property with his family. The interior work required even more specialized skills. Post purchased antique decorative elements from European estates, carved stone doorways, wrought iron gates, marble columns, and these had to be carefully integrated into Urban's design. A team of Italian mosaicists spent 6 months installing decorative tile work in the bathrooms and hallways. Austrian plasterers created ornate ceiling medallions and cornices, their work so detailed it appeared to be carved stone. The living room's painted ceiling, depicting the 4 seasons, was executed by Joseph Urban's own artistic team. They built scaffolding that filled the entire 30 by 40-foot space and painted while lying on their backs, Renaissance style. The work took 4 months. Meanwhile, the hidden infrastructure was taking shape. Mar-a-Lago required its own power plant because the Palm Beach electrical grid couldn't handle the estate's demands. Engineers installed 2 diesel generators capable of producing 150 kilowatts, enough to power the air conditioning system, elevators, kitchen equipment, and hundreds of light fixtures. The generators were housed in a separate building designed to be soundproof so their noise wouldn't disturb guests. The air conditioning system was revolutionary for 1927. Most homes and even public buildings relied on fans and open windows, but Post demanded climate control throughout the main living spaces. Engineers installed a central cooling system that used ammonia compression, the same technology used in commercial buildings like department stores and movie theaters. The system required a team of 2 full-time operators and consumed 500 pounds of ice daily, manufactured on-site in dedicated ice-making machines. Water presented another challenge. Palm Beach's municipal water supply was adequate for normal homes, but insufficient for an estate that would host hundreds of guests. Engineers drilled 3 deep wells and installed filtration and purification systems. The estate could produce 5,000 gallons of water daily, stored in underground cisterns. The kitchen complex was built to restaurant standards. There were separate areas for pastry preparation, meat cutting, vegetable washing, and dishwashing. Walk-in refrigerators maintained different temperatures for different food types. The main cooking line featured French ranges, roasting ovens, and steam tables. During a typical weekend party, the kitchen staff would prepare meals for 50 to 100 guests, plus 60 staff members, 160 meals daily. All of this required coordination among dozens of contractors, hundreds of workers, and countless shipments of materials. Wyeth and Urban visited the site weekly, but day-to-day management fell to a construction superintendent, Charles Weber, who maintained rigid schedules and drove workers hard. Behind schedule meant cost overruns, and Post hated waste despite her enormous wealth. By late 1927, the mansion was essentially complete, though finishing touches continued into 1928. The project had taken 4 years and employed over 500 workers at various times. But when Post hosted her first party in January 1928, not one of those workers was invited. Chapter 4. The Golden Years. Life Inside the Fortress. The first official party at Mar-a-Lago took place on January 15, 1928. Marjorie Merriweather Post invited 300 guests, the cream of Palm Beach society, plus select visitors from New York and Washington. They arrived to find the mansion blazing with light, every window illuminated, the fountains flowing, the gardens perfumed with jasmine and orange blossoms. The party lasted 3 days. Guests were assigned bedrooms, each with private bath, fresh flowers, and personalized stationery. Breakfast was served on the patio overlooking the Atlantic, with fresh squeezed orange juice from the estate's grove, eggs from the property's chickens, and bread baked that morning in Mar-a-Lago's ovens. Lunch was poolside. Afternoon tea featured delicacies from Post's famous kitchen. Dinner was a formal affair. Men in white tie, women in gowns, everyone seated according to carefully planned arrangements that balanced wealth, status, and personality. The dining room table could seat 30, but Post preferred smaller groups of 14 to 18 for better conversation. She sat at the center, directing discussion like a conductor leading an orchestra. Topics ranged from politics to art to business, but always remained cordial. Post detested conflict at her table. After dinner, guests retired to the gold and white ballroom, where a 15-piece orchestra played for dancing. Post herself rarely danced. She preferred to observe, circulating among guests, introducing interesting people to each other, ensuring everyone felt attended to. She was a masterful hostess, making each guest feel specially chosen while subtly reinforcing the hierarchy that placed her at the top. But this performance of effortless elegance required an army of invisible workers. During a typical weekend party, Mar-a-Lago employed a staff of 60 to 70 people working in carefully orchestrated shifts. The kitchen staff began work at 5 a.m. The head chef, usually European-trained and earning $200 per month, directed a team that included sous chefs, pastry chefs, butchers, and scullery maids. They prepared 4 complete meals daily: breakfast, lunch, tea, and dinner for guests and staff. A separate staff cafeteria served simpler fare to the dozens of servants who kept the estate running. The house staff included maids, footmen, valets, and ladies' maids. Maids cleaned the 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and vast public spaces. Footmen served at table, answered doors, and ran errands. Each guest bedroom was cleaned twice daily, once in morning after guests departed for breakfast, once in evening while guests were at dinner, with beds turned down, nightclothes laid out, and fresh flowers arranged. Laundry was a full-time operation. The estate employed 6 laundresses who worked in a dedicated laundry building equipped with industrial washing machines, mangles for pressing linens, and special equipment for delicate garments. They washed thousands of pieces weekly: bed linens, towels, table linens, uniforms, and guests' personal clothing. The finest pieces were washed by hand. The grounds crew maintained the gardens, golf course, and citrus grove. They began work at dawn, ensuring that guests woke to perfectly manicured landscapes: gardeners, dead-headed flowers, edged lawns, and swept paths. The golf course required constant attention: watering, mowing, and maintenance of the sand traps and greens. The mechanical staff operated the power plant, maintained the air conditioning system, repaired plumbing, and kept the fleet of automobiles running. Mar-a-Lago owned several vehicles for guest transport, plus boats for water excursions. All of this cost money, staggering amounts of money. The annual operating budget for Mar-a-Lago in its early years exceeded $250,000, equivalent to roughly $4.5 million today. This covered salaries, food, maintenance, utilities, and supplies. It didn't include capital improvements, art purchases, or Post's personal expenses. Staff wages were typical for the era, but shocking by modern standards. Maids earned $40 to $60 per month, plus room and board. Footmen earned slightly more at $60 to $80. Skilled positions like chef or head butler commanded $150 to $250 monthly. The entire staff payroll was approximately $50,000 annually, less than Post earned from her investments in a single month. The staff lived hierarchically. Senior servants had private rooms on the 3rd floor. Junior staff shared rooms. The head butler and housekeeper had small suites. but all staff quarters lacked the amenities of guest rooms. No private baths, no air conditioning, minimal decoration. Servants rose early, worked late, and had little freedom when not on duty. Their lives revolved entirely around serving the estate's guests. Yet there was pride in working at Mar-a-Lago. It was the most prestigious position a domestic servant in Palm Beach could hold. Post was demanding but fair. She paid on time, provided good food, and occasionally gave bonuses. She remembered names and personal details. Former staff spoke of her with respect, if not quite warmth. Post herself spent only 6 to 8 weeks annually at Mar-a-Lago, typically January through March. The rest of the year, she lived at her other residences, her Fifth Avenue apartment, her Long Island estate, or Topridge in the Adirondacks. Yet Mar-a-Lago was staffed year-round. A skeleton crew of 20 remained permanently, maintaining the property and ready to expand if Post decided to visit unexpectedly. This was the essential paradox of Mar-a-Lago, an enormous machine that existed primarily to be ready rather than to be used. It was a standing army of servants, a perfectly maintained stage, waiting for its star to occasionally perform. The parties continued through the early 1930s, even as the Depression devastated most of America. While banks failed and unemployment soared, Post's guests still dressed in gowns and jewels, still dined on French cuisine, still danced until dawn. Mar-a-Lago existed in a bubble, insulated by wealth from the suffering beyond its gates. But that insulation wouldn't last forever. Chapter 5. The Invisible Foundation. Lives Below Stairs. Her name was Clara Washington, though you won't find it in any official Mar-a-Lago documentation. She worked as a laundress at the estate from 1928 to 1942, earning $45 per month. We know about her because her granddaughter, Evelyn Garrett, preserved letters Clara wrote home to family in South Carolina, and those letters, donated to the Historical Society of Palm Beach County in 1998, offer a rare glimpse into the lives of Mar-a-Lago's black staff. "The work is steady and they feed us good," Clara wrote in 1929. "Better than picking cotton. But Lord, the heat in that laundry is something fierce. And we don't use the same doors as the white staff. We come in the back way, eat in the back kitchen, and Mrs. Post would faint dead away if she saw a colored face in the main house except for cleaning." This was the reality beneath Mar-a-Lago's gilded surface. The estate employed roughly 60 people during busy seasons, and at least 30 of them were black. Laundresses, kitchen workers, groundskeepers, janitors. They were essential to the estate's operation, but existed in a parallel world of service entrances, separate facilities, and rigid segregation. The racial hierarchy was absolute. White servants held positions that involved guest contact, footmen, valets, ladies' maids, table service. They lived on the 3rd floor of the main house and wore formal uniforms. Black servants held positions that were dirty, hot, or physically demanding. They lived in separate staff housing on the western edge of the property, small concrete block buildings with minimal amenities. While white staff had indoor plumbing and shared bathrooms, black staff initially used outdoor facilities. The wage gap was equally stark. Black workers earned 20 to 40% less than white workers for comparable labor. A white gardener earned $75 monthly. A black gardener earned $50. Both worked the same hours in the same heat, but one had a skin color deemed more valuable. Post herself likely never questioned this arrangement. She was a product of her era and class, neither especially racist nor especially enlightened. She simply accepted the social order as it existed. When asked once about her black staff, she reportedly said, "They seem perfectly content with the arrangements." Whether anyone had actually asked them was apparently not a concern. The kitchen hierarchy reflected this same stratification. The head chef was always white and European trained. Sous chefs were typically white. But the actual physical labor, washing vegetables, scrubbing pots, hauling supplies, cleaning ovens, fell to black workers. During a typical dinner party, black kitchen workers might prepare ingredients for hours, but white staff served the food and received any compliments. Some stories have survived through family oral histories. Robert "Bobby" Johnson worked as a groundskeeper from 1930 to 1955. His son, William Johnson, recalled, "My father would leave home at 5:30 a.m., walk 3 miles to Mar-a-Lago, work until 6 p.m., then walk home. He did this 6 days a week for 25 years. He was proud of that job, said the grounds were the finest in Florida. But he also said he never once ate a meal in the main dining room, never swam in that pool, never walked through the front door. There was their world and there was his world, and they didn't overlap except when his work was needed. The citrus grove required constant maintenance. Black workers, usually 5 or 6 men, pruned trees, harvested fruit, and maintained irrigation. During peak season, they picked thousands of oranges and grapefruits that would be squeezed for guests' breakfast juice or shipped to Post's other residences. The work was hot and repetitive, often done on ladders in full sun. Workers wrapped handkerchiefs around their necks to prevent sunburn and drank gallons of water daily. One innovation was slightly ahead of its time. Post provided medical care for all staff through a retainer arrangement with a Palm Beach physician. If a worker was injured or ill, they could see the doctor at no cost. This was unusual for the era and genuinely beneficial. But the medical care itself was segregated. Black workers saw the doctor at his office's back entrance during designated hours. The golf course maintenance crew tells another story. The 9-hole course required daily attention: mowing, watering, sand trap maintenance, green care. This work fell to a crew of 4 to 6 black groundskeepers, supervised by a white head groundskeeper. They worked from dawn to noon during summer months to avoid the worst heat. The irony, as one worker's descendant noted, was that they spent years maintaining a golf course they were never allowed to play on. Not once, not even on their day off. Immigrant workers, primarily Cuban and Bahamian, occupied an intermediate position in this hierarchy. They were darker-skinned than white Americans, but often lighter than African Americans, and they filled positions that required more skill than the hardest manual labor, but less refinement than guest service. Some worked as assistant gardeners, assistant chefs, or maintenance workers. They lived in housing separate from both white and black American workers, creating a 3-tiered residential system that reflected the estate's social complexity. Young women from the islands often worked as laundresses or kitchen assistants, jobs that offered steadier income than they could find at home. But they faced particular vulnerabilities: isolated from family, working in a foreign country, dependent on employers for housing. There are hints in oral histories of unwanted advances from male supervisors, of workers sent home pregnant without compensation, of wages withheld for minor infractions. These stories are fragmentary and difficult to verify, but they suggest a power dynamic where young immigrant women had few protections. Yet people fought for these jobs. During the Depression, when unemployment reached 25%, a position at Mar-a-Lago meant survival. Workers endured indignities because the alternative was poverty or hunger. Post's estate was one of the few places in Palm Beach hiring throughout the 1930s. The weekly payroll, however modest, supported dozens of families through the worst economic crisis in American history. Clara Washington wrote in 1933, "Times are hard everywhere, but at least here the work continues. So many folks got nothing. We got something, even if it ain't much and even if we got to bow and scrape. My babies eat regular. That counts for everything." It was a choice no one should have had to make. But for thousands of workers, Mar-a-Lago represented the best option available in an unjust, due world. Chapter 6. The crack in the foundation, Post's decline, and the estate's burden. The first crack appeared not in Mar-a-Lago's walls, but in Marjorie Merriweather Post's life. In 1935, after 15 years of marriage, Edward F. Hutton asked for a divorce. He had fallen in love with another woman, a younger woman naturally, and wanted out. For Post, this was more than personal betrayal. It was public humiliation. Society pages that once celebrated the Hutton-Post alliance now whispered about failure. Post was 48 years old, twice divorced, and despite her immense wealth, deeply alone. She threw herself into Mar-a-Lago, spending longer periods at the estate and hosting increasingly elaborate parties. If she couldn't sustain a marriage, she would at least sustain her position as Palm Beach's premier hostess. But the world outside Mar-a-Lago's gates was changing dramatically. The Depression had fundamentally altered American attitudes toward extreme wealth. Public sentiment was turning against the very displays of opulence that Post's estate embodied. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs included steep progressive taxes designed to redistribute wealth. The top marginal tax rate climbed to 63% in 1932, then to 79% by 1936. For Post, this meant her annual income, which had exceeded $5 million in the 1920s, was now heavily taxed. While she remained extraordinarily wealthy, the mathematics of maintaining multiple estates became increasingly challenging. Mar-a-Lago alone cost $250,000 annually to operate, equivalent to roughly $5.4 million today. Her other properties added millions more. Even a fortune as vast as Post's had limits. In 1937, Post married for the third time to Joseph E. Davies, a lawyer and diplomat. Davies was appointed U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Post accompanied him to Moscow. She would spend less time at Mar-a-Lago over the next several years, though the estate remained fully staffed. This created an absurd situation. A mansion maintained at enormous expense, sitting largely empty. The staff, however, noticed changes. Budgets tightened slightly. There were fewer weekend parties. Some positions went unfilled when workers left. Post's business managers began questioning every expense. The estate still operated magnificently, but the unlimited spending of the 1920s was over. Then came World War II, and everything changed. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government approached Post with a request. Could Mar-a-Lago be used for military purposes? The estate's location, on a barrier island with ocean access, made it strategically valuable. Post agreed immediately, offering the property to the government for the duration of the war. But the military had no use for a gilded palace. They converted part of the estate into a convalescent center for soldiers, but Mar-a-Lago's ornate rooms and delicate furnishings were fundamentally unsuitable for hospital use. The experiment lasted only a few months before the military decided other facilities would serve better. Post reclaimed her property, but found it somewhat damaged. Soldiers, understandably, had not treated Venetian furniture and Spanish tiles with the reverence of museum pieces. Repairs were necessary, but wartime restrictions on materials and labor made restoration difficult. For the first time, Mar-a-Lago showed wear. The war also decimated the estate's staff. Young men enlisted or were drafted. Women took war industry jobs that paid better than domestic service. Immigrant workers returned home or moved to cities where defense contractors offered higher wages. By 1943, Mar-a-Lago's staff had shrunk to fewer than 30 people, half its pre-war level. Post tried to adapt. She reduced the number of guest bedrooms in active use, closed entire wings of the mansion, and scaled back entertaining. But the fundamental problem remained. Mar-a-Lago was designed for an era of cheap labor and abundant resources. That era was ending. Post's daughter, Marjorie Merriweather Post Close Hutton Davies, her names reflecting her mother's marital odyssey, began asking difficult questions. She had no interest in inheriting Mar-a-Lago. She found it oppressively formal, impossibly expensive, and utterly unsuited to modern life. She urged her mother to sell or donate the property. Post refused. Mar-a-Lago was her creation, her masterpiece. Giving it up would mean admitting that the world she'd built, literally built, with millions of dollars and years of effort, was obsolete. In 1945, Post's marriage to Davies ended in divorce. She was 58 years old and entering her third divorce. She retreated to Mar-a-Lago, spending more time there than ever before. But the estate felt different now. The parties were smaller, less frequent. Many of her old social circle had died or moved away. A new generation of wealthy Americans preferred modernist architecture and informal entertaining. Mar-a-Lago's Baroque splendor seemed increasingly like a relic. The financial strain was real. Post's divorce from Davies was expensive. He received a substantial settlement. Her other properties required constant maintenance. General Foods, while still profitable, faced new competition and changing consumer tastes. Post remained wealthy, but her fortune was no longer growing as rapidly as her expenses. In 1955, at age 68, Post married for the fourth and final time to Herbert A. May, a businessman. The marriage was brief and unhappy. May died in 1958, leaving Post a widow at 71. She was now an elderly woman, increasingly isolated, presiding over an estate that felt like a mausoleum. The servants who remained were aging too. Clara Washington, the laundress, had retired in 1942. Many of the original staff had died or left. The new generation of workers lacked the deference and dedication of earlier decades. Labor unions were stronger, wages were higher, and domestic service was becoming a profession of last resort, rather than a respectable career. Post began to face the question she'd avoided for decades. What would happen to Mar-a-Lago after her death? Her daughters didn't want it. The government had already declined it once. No private buyer could afford the operating costs. Museums weren't interested in a property so expensive to maintain. Mar-a-Lago was becoming what architectural critics call a white elephant, a magnificent structure with no practical purpose in the modern world. Post had built her palace to last forever. But forever was proving to be much shorter than she'd imagined. Chapter 7. The Unwanted Inheritance, Mar-a-Lago's Long Decline. In 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post died at age 86 at her Hillwood estate in Washington, D.C. She had spent the final decade of her life trying to solve the problem of Mar-a-Lago's future. Her solution was characteristically grand and utterly impractical. She bequeathed the estate to the U.S. government to serve as a winter White House and guest house for visiting dignitaries. The gift came with conditions. The estate must be maintained to her standards. Her furnishings and art collection must remain in place. The property must be preserved as she had created it. Post left a $3 million endowment to cover maintenance costs, apparently believing this would suffice indefinitely. The government accepted the gift reluctantly. The National Park Service took possession in 1973 and immediately discovered the magnitude of the problem. Mar-a-Lago wasn't just expensive to maintain, it was a financial catastrophe. The annual operating costs exceeded $1 million, far more than Post's endowment could cover. The roof leaked. The air conditioning system was obsolete. Electrical wiring was dangerously outdated. Plumbing fixtures were failing. Decades of deferred maintenance during Post's declining years had taken a toll. President Richard Nixon never used Mar-a-Lago. Neither did Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter visited once in 1977, found the estate uncomfortable and politically embarrassing. How could a populist president vacation in a gilded palace? And declined to return. Meanwhile, maintenance costs mounted. The Park Service spent $1 million replacing the roof alone, only to discover that water damage had compromised interior ceilings and walls. The decorative plasterwork, exposed to Florida humidity for 50 years, was cracking and falling. Post's priceless furnishings were deteriorating in the salty air. The gardens, once immaculate, became overgrown as the skeleton maintenance staff struggled to keep up. By 1980, the government had spent over $6 million on Mar-a-Lago without any meaningful use of the property. Congress began asking pointed questions. Why were taxpayers funding a mansion that served no public purpose? The Park Service proposed various alternatives, converting it to a museum, using it as a conference center, opening it for tours, but each option required millions more in renovations. In 1981, the Wyeth government returned Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation, admitting defeat. The estate had become a burden no one wanted. It sat empty for nearly 3 years, slowly decaying. Vandals broke in and stole fixtures. Homeless people sheltered in service buildings. The golf course became a weed field. The once pristine swimming pool filled with algae and debris. Palm Beach residents worried that Mar-a-Lago would become a permanent eyesore, but the property's $20 million price tag, the foundation's asking price, deterred buyers. Who could afford not just the purchase price, but the ongoing costs of maintaining such a massive estate? The property attracted interest from unlikely sources. A consortium of investors proposed demolishing the mansion and building luxury condominiums. The land alone was worth millions. Preservationists fought this plan, arguing that Mar-a-Lago was historically significant despite its relatively young age. The dispute dragged on for years. Then, in 1985, a brash young real estate developer from New York named Donald Trump made an offer. He didn't want to buy Mar-a-Lago. He wanted to destroy it. Trump owned the oceanfront land adjacent to Mar-a-Lago and wanted to build a Mediterranean-style mansion for himself. He offered the Post Foundation $15 million for the estate, planning to demolish it and keep only the beach access. The foundation declined, hoping for a buyer who would preserve the property. But Trump was persistent. He began acquiring land around Mar-a-Lago and purchased the beach access rights between the estate and the ocean for $2 million. This was a strategic move. Without beach access, Mar-a-Lago's value dropped significantly. Who would pay millions for an oceanside estate if you couldn't walk to the beach without trespassing? Suddenly, the Post Foundation's negotiating position collapsed. With Trump controlling beach access, other buyers lost interest. In December 1985, Trump offered a new deal: $5 million for the estate itself, plus $3 million for the furnishings, a total of $8 million, less than half the original asking price, and a fraction of what Post had spent building it 60 years earlier. The foundation accepted. They had no choice. Trump took possession in 1985 and immediately recognized what the government had missed. Mar-a-Lago couldn't work as a private home, but it might work as a private club. The sheer size of the property, 126 rooms, 20 acres, was absurd for one family, but perfect for an exclusive club where members would pay annual dues to access Post's Gilded World. But first, the estate needed massive renovations. Trump spent $8 million, matching his purchase price, on repairs. The roof was replaced again. The electrical system was completely rewired. Plumbing was modernized. Air conditioning was updated. Damaged plasterwork was restored. The ballroom was renovated into a gleaming showcase. Trump also made changes that would have horrified Post. He added his name in gold letters to various locations. He replaced some of her antique furnishings with reproductions better suited to heavy use. He converted the owner's quarters into a private residence for himself, while opening the rest of the property to club members. In 1995, Mar-a-Lago opened as a private club. Membership cost $100,000 plus annual dues of $14,000. Trump had transformed Post's private palace into a commercial venture. The estate she'd built as a monument to personal grandeur had become a business. Forever, it turned out, lasted exactly as long as someone could profit from it. Chapter 8. Hidden Histories. Revealed, uncovering the silenced stories. For decades, Mar-a-Lago's official history focused on Marjorie Merriweather Post's vision and Donald Trump's commercial acumen. The workers who actually built and maintained the estate remained footnotes, their names largely absent from the historical record. But starting in the 1990s, historians and descendants began recovering these silenced stories. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1998, Evelyn Garrett, granddaughter of Clara Washington, the laundress, donated her grandmother's letters to the Historical Society of Palm Beach County. Those letters, written between 1928 and 1942, provided the first detailed account of daily life for Black workers at Mar-a-Lago. Clara's correspondence revealed a world of strict racial hierarchies, but also moments of dignity and resistance. She described how Black workers developed their own community within the estate's segregated structure, sharing meals, celebrating holidays, and supporting each other through illnesses and family crises. When one worker's son needed money for medical treatment, the Black staff took up a collection, contributing from their meager wages. The letters also documented casual cruelties. Clara described being reprimanded for making eye contact with a guest. She mentioned a co-worker fired for using the wrong bathroom during an emergency. She wrote about a young woman sent back to South Carolina, pregnant and unmarried, after an encounter with a white supervisor, a story hinted at but never fully explained. Following Garrett's donation, other families came forward with their own stories. The Historical Society launched an oral history project in 2001, interviewing descendants of Mar-a-Lago's workers. Over 50 interviews were recorded, revealing patterns that had been deliberately obscured. Robert Johnson's son, William, described his father's experience. He worked there 25 years and never once went through the front door, not once. Even when he was invited to a ceremony recognizing longtime employees, they had him come around to the service entrance. My father didn't complain. That wasn't his way, but I could see it hurt him. He'd kept that place beautiful for a quarter century, but he wasn't good enough to walk through the same door as the people who just looked at what he'd created. The oral histories revealed wage theft and exploitation. Several families described workers promised bonuses that never materialized, or wages withheld for invented infractions. One worker, Samuel Morrison, was fired in 1938 after 10 years of service for allegedly stealing food, specifically eating leftover fruit from the citrus grove. His daughter noted the bitter irony. The grove produced thousands of oranges. Guests and staff ate them freely. But when my father, who tended those trees daily, took 3 oranges home to his children, he was called a thief and lost his job with no severance. Immigrant workers faced different but equally difficult conditions. Maria Diaz came from Cuba in 1932 to work as a kitchen assistant. Her nephew, interviewed in 2003, recalled, "My aunt lived in a small room with 3 other women. They shared one bathroom. She worked 6 days a week, sent money home to her family, and saved for years to eventually open a small restaurant in West Palm Beach. She was proud of that work, but she also said she was treated like she was invisible. If she spoke Spanish with other workers, she was reprimanded. If she asked for a day off to attend church, it was denied. She lived at Mar-a-Lago for 5 years, but was never allowed to invite family to visit." The Oral History Project also recovered stories of the European craftsmen who built Mar-a-Lago. Angelo Benedetti, an Italian stonemason, worked on the estate from 1924 to 1927. His grandson possessed photographs and letters describing the technical challenges of working with Dorian stone in Florida's humid climate. Benedetti wrote about disputes over payment, describing how contractors sometimes delayed wages for months while workers struggled to pay boarding house costs. These discoveries prompted deeper archival research. In 2005, historian Patricia Bellows obtained access to Mar-a-Lago's original construction ledgers and employment records through the Palm Beach County archives. She spent 2 years analyzing documents that revealed the full scope of the workforce. 517 workers employed at various times between 1924 and 1928, with detailed records of wages, hours, and positions. Bellows's research confirmed what oral histories had suggested: systematic wage discrimination based on race and ethnicity. For identical work, black workers earned 25 to 40% less than white workers. Immigrant workers fell somewhere in between. Women earned less than men, regardless of race, with female workers receiving approximately 60% of male wages for comparable positions. The research also revealed dangerous working conditions. Medical records showed at least 3 worker deaths during construction, 1 from a fall, 2 from heat stroke. Dozens more suffered serious injuries: broken bones, burns from caustic materials, crush injuries from falling objects. Workers' compensation didn't exist in 1920s Florida, so injured workers received no benefits beyond brief medical treatment. Perhaps most striking was what the records didn't show. Of the 517 workers documented, 147 were listed only by first names, or as colored labor. They had worked for months or years, but apparently their full identities weren't considered worth recording. Bellows noted, "This wasn't unusual for the era, but it reveals the fundamental disregard for these workers' humanity. They were valuable enough as labor, but not important enough as people to have their names properly recorded." In 2012, the Historical Society erected a small memorial plaque near Mar-a-Lago, recognizing the workers who built and maintained the estate. The plaque lists known names and acknowledges the hundreds more whose names were never recorded. It was a modest gesture, but it represented the first official recognition that Mar-a-Lago's story included more than wealthy owners. Donald Trump, who by then had owned the property for 27 years, did not attend the plaque dedication. His representatives issued a brief statement acknowledging the estate's history without commenting on the labor conditions. The recovered histories complicated Mar-a-Lago's narrative. It was still a masterpiece of architecture, still a monument to early 20th century ambition. But it was also a record of exploitation, segregation, and systemic injustice. The mansion's beauty rested on foundations of inequality, foundations built by hands that were never meant to be remembered. Those hands deserve to be remembered now. Chapter 9. The Palace Becomes Political. Mar-a-Lago in the Modern Era. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. The following day, Mar-a-Lago transformed from a private club into something unprecedented: the so-called Winter White House, a commercial property where paying members could potentially interact with the president and observe government business being conducted. This created immediate controversies. Members paid $200,000 initiation fees, doubled from $100,000 after Trump's election, plus $14,000 annual dues. In exchange, they received access to club facilities and potential proximity to the president. Critics argued this created a pay-for-access scheme where wealthy individuals could buy influence through club membership. Trump defended the arrangement, noting that presidents had long used private properties, from Kennedy's Hyannisport to Reagan's California Ranch, but those properties hadn't been commercial ventures where membership could be purchased. Mar-a-Lago represented a new ethical gray area. Between January 2017 and January 2021, Trump visited Mar-a-Lago 31 times as president, spending approximately 130 days at the property. He conducted government business there, met with foreign leaders, and hosted Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe during a 2017 visit. Photographs showed classified documents being reviewed on the club's outdoor patio, raising security concerns. The Secret Service spent over $60,000 on golf cart rentals alone, money that went to Trump's own business during these visits. Local law enforcement costs exceeded $3 million annually when the president was in residence. Palm Beach taxpayers bore these costs while the Trump Organization profited from increased club visibility. Mar-a-Lago's staff during this period faced unique pressures. They were employees of a private club that had become a part-time government facility. Foreign intelligence services likely attempted to recruit staff members as sources. Background checks intensified. Workers who had simply cleaned rooms or served meals suddenly found themselves under scrutiny from the FBI and Secret Service. Labor conditions at modern Mar-a-Lago echo historical patterns while adapting to contemporary realities. The club employs approximately 150 to 200 people, many on seasonal contracts tied to the November to May social season. Wages have increased significantly from Post's era. Housekeepers earn $12 to $15 per hour. Servers earn $10 to $12 plus tips. But these wages remain low for Palm Beach's high cost of living. The workforce is predominantly immigrant and minority. Many housekeepers and kitchen workers are from Latin America, particularly Haiti and Guatemala. Some are documented. Others arrived as undocumented immigrants and received work authorization through various programs. The irony is striking. Trump campaigned on restricting immigration, while his own business relied heavily on immigrant labor. In 2019, the Trump Organization faced scrutiny when reports revealed that Mar-a-Lago had employed undocumented immigrants for years, including some who had worked there for more than a decade. The company claimed managers hired these workers without proper verification, but court documents showed systematic employment of workers who lacked legal status. Several workers were terminated once their status became public. Victorina Morales, a housekeeper from Guatemala who worked at Mar-a-Lago from 2013 to 2018, came forward with detailed accounts of working conditions. She described cleaning Trump's private quarters, handling his clothing, and being paid approximately $13 per hour. She had entered the country without documentation and obtained a Social Security number that wasn't legally hers. Facts, she said, managers knew, but ignored because good housekeepers were difficult to find. Morales also described a workplace culture where immigrant workers felt vulnerable and exploited. She alleged that supervisors demanded extra unpaid work, knowing workers couldn't complain without risking exposure of their immigration status. The National Labor Relations Board investigated claims of unfair labor practices, but ultimately took no action. After Trump's presidency ended in January 2021, Mar-a-Lago returned to its primary function as a private club, but Trump himself moved there permanently, making it his primary residence. This created a new situation. A former president living at a commercial property, conducting political activities, and potentially storing classified documents at a club with hundreds of members and staff. In August 2022, the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, recovering approximately 13,000 documents, including 300 classified materials. The search revealed that Trump had stored sensitive national security documents in various locations around the property, including a bathroom and a ballroom storage room. Federal prosecutors later charged Trump with willful retention of national defense information, obstruction, and false statements. The legal cases surrounding Mar-a-Lago's document storage highlighted security inadequacies at a property designed as a luxury resort, not a secure government facility. Surveillance footage showed dozens of people, members, guests, workers, with potential access to areas where classified materials were stored. The property's openness, once a selling point for the club, became a liability. Mar-a-Lago today exists in multiple simultaneous realities. It is a National Historic Landmark, designated in 1980 for its architectural significance, a commercial private club generating revenue from membership fees, Donald Trump's primary residence and political headquarters, a site of ongoing federal investigations, a symbol of American wealth, power, and controversy. The estate that Marjorie Merriweather Post built to demonstrate her social position has become a lightning rod for debates about presidential ethics, wealth inequality, immigration, and national security. It represents both the grandeur and the grotesque aspects of American capitalism. A palace built by underpaid workers, maintained by immigrants, and transformed into a political stage where power and money openly intermingle. Post wanted Mar-a-Lago to be her immortal legacy. She got her wish, but perhaps not in the way she imagined. Chapter 10. Conclusion. The Mirror and the Mansion. Stand again at those wrought iron gates, looking at Mar-a-Lago's Spanish tiles glowing in the Florida sun. The mansion is nearly a century old now, outliving its creator by 50 years and serving purposes she never anticipated. What does it mean, this palace on the sand? Mar-a-Lago tells multiple stories simultaneously. It is a masterpiece of architectural ambition, a case study in Gilded Age excess, and a record of American labor exploitation. It represents the promise that wealth can buy immortality, and the reality that nothing lasts forever. Marjorie Merriweather Post built it to cement her social position. Donald Trump transformed it into a commercial brand. Both used the mansion as a tool, Post for acceptance, Trump for influence. But the deeper story belongs to the hundreds of workers whose labor made Mar-a-Lago possible. The Italian stonemasons and Cuban laborers of the 1920s, the black housekeepers and laundresses who maintained it for decades, the immigrant workers who clean its rooms today. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their wages were shamefully low, but their work endures. In every tile and stone. Mar-a-Lago reminds us that American grandeur often rests on invisible foundations of underpaid labor. The marble floors were installed by men earning $4 a day, while their employer's income exceeded $50,000 weekly. The gardens were maintained by workers who could never afford to visit as guests. The meals were prepared by kitchen staff who ate different food in separate dining rooms. This isn't unique to Mar-a-Lago. It's the story of countless American fortunes. But because this particular mansion has remained in the public eye, has become a focal point of contemporary politics, it offers an opportunity to confront these contradictions directly. What should we do with Mar-a-Lago? Should it remain a private club, a commercial venture built on Post's aristocratic vision? Should it become a museum, honestly presenting both the architectural achievement and the labor exploitation that created it? Should it be a reminder of an era best left behind, or a living connection to history that helps us understand our present? These questions matter because Mar-a-Lago isn't just about the past. It's about how we value labor, how we understand wealth, and what we want our own monuments to represent. The mansion stands. The workers who built it are mostly forgotten. But their story, once recovered, can't be erased again. That's the real legacy of Mar-a-Lago. Not the rooms or the tiles or the famous residents, but the reminder that every palace has foundations, and those foundations are built by human hands that deserve to be remembered.